Ukraine has just sustained a catastrophic, direct strike to the very heart of its air combat capabilities. The destruction of the F-16 airbase, reduced to smouldering ruins, has left the NATO alliance in a state of profound shock at the velocity of events unfolding over a mere 96-hour window. There was no preliminary warning, no symbolic act of deterrence. In this instance, Moscow elected to strike directly, with overwhelming force and surgical precision, targeting the exact asset the West had championed as a strategic game-changer, capable of turning the tide of the battlefield. The chain of kinetic events originated at the NATO-supported F-16 facility, widely believed to be the clandestine staging ground for the inaugural squadron of Western fighter jets dispatched to Ukraine. The outcome was a massive conflagration, columns of billowing black smoke, and a deafening diplomatic silence from Washington, a silence so profound it felt as though the very atmosphere had been evacuated from the White House, while Kyiv maintains its narrative of a 100% interception rate, a triangulation of satellite reconnaissance, citizen live streams capturing detonations, and NATO's uncharacteristic reticence narrates a diverging reality. Russia is not merely engaging military objectives, they are dismantling the West's defensive facade, exposing systemic vulnerabilities the alliance has labored to conceal for 2 years. Consequently, the strategic calculus has shifted from what will the next target be to the existential questions: who will blink first, and who is ensnared in a trap of their own making. In the immediate aftermath, a saturation fire campaign was unleashed across the Ukrainian theatre. Within a span of 4 days, Russia deployed over 900 loitering munitions, hundreds of Kh-101 cruise missiles, and Iskander ballistic missiles, targeting critical nodes from Kharkiv and Kyiv to Khmelnytsky. The capital, Kyiv, has been forced to keep air raid sirens wailing almost incessantly. At times, for up to 12 hours a day, the airspace has transformed from a contested combat zone into a live-fire testing crucible for Russian long-range precision assets. Vital military and civilian infrastructure across a vast swathe of territory has been degraded, leaving behind only charred skeletal remains of concrete. Amidst this, President Zelensky has issued a sharp rebuke, characterizing this not as a military operation, but as a brutal act of politicization. He has urgently appealed to the West, imploring the United States and the European Union to drastically escalate sanctions against Russia, specifically targeting the petroleum sector, banking institutions, and technology supply chains. Yet, a paradox emerges within the grim reality of the battlefield. If these were not valid military targets, why were the sites obliterated, specifically F-16 operational bases, missile stockpiles, air defense radar arrays, and strategic nodes meticulously fortified by NATO? Moscow has explicitly stated this was a retaliatory measure following Ukrainian cross-border UAV incursions into the Belgorod and Kursk provinces. Numerous Russian defense analysts have even posited that Kyiv inadvertently handed Moscow the perfect casus belli to initiate a campaign of large-scale destruction. The Starokostiantyniv airbase, the beacon of hope for Ukraine. The West, regarding the F-16 program, became the epicenter of this catastrophe. This strategic installation had absorbed hundreds of millions of dollars in NATO capital investment, runway modernization, hardened aircraft, shelters, munitions, depots, and specifically, a maintenance wing dedicated to the F-16 platform. Yet, in a single night, those aspirations were reduced to ash. The Kh-101 missiles struck at dawn, and despite Kyiv's assertions of a perfect interception record, local footage, seismic data, and satellite imagery all corroborate an explosion of unprecedented magnitude. Approximately half of the base's infrastructure was effectively annihilated. Western media initially maintained a total blackout, followed by only sparse reporting. However, independent defense experts have confirmed the destruction of at least 4 F-16 airframes, alongside the precision munitions arsenal and auxiliary radar systems. If verified, this constitutes Russia's most significant direct strike on Western-supplied military infrastructure within Ukraine since the onset of hostilities. More critically, NATO was struck directly at its strategic heart and found itself completely impotent to respond. The Starokostiantyniv base, once heralded as a symbol of impending victory, has transformed into a stark warning. The F-16 is not a panacea, nor a magic wand capable of unilaterally reversing the battlefield's momentum. Kyiv continues to insist that it neutralized 100% of the Kh-101 missiles, but the plumes of smoke and fire dominating the skyline over Khmelnytsky offer irrefutable counter-evidence. Even as the victory announcement was being broadcast, local television feeds captured a massive column of black smoke ascending from the base. Live streams from residents documented earth-shattering secondary explosions, fractured terrain, and fleets of ambulances rushing toward the inferno in the night. Even Fly Control, a military news outlet sympathetic to the Ukrainian government, was compelled to concede. The damage is undeniable. Kyiv should not insult the intelligence of the public. This incident precipitates a far more grave inquiry. If the Patriot air defense system, the crown jewel of American defensive technology, cannot intercept the Kh-101, upon what else can Ukraine rely? The Kh-101 is not a hypersonic weapon. It is a subsonic cruise missile, utilizing low observable stealth technology and terrain-hugging flight paths to evade detection. If the Patriot architecture allows such a threat to penetrate, what fate awaits other sectors? While Kyiv attempts to patch up the erosion of public trust, the geopolitical situation has entered a new phase of escalation driven by the West. Following these successive airstrikes, the question arises: is NATO unleashing Kyiv to exercise legitimate self-defense? Or is it inadvertently flipping the switch on a new, uncontrolled level of conflict? After 3 days of Ukraine enduring a relentless missile barrage, Western capitals arrived at an unprecedented decision. They have completely rescinded range restrictions on weaponry supplied to Ukraine. The red circles previously drawn on the map have been erased. The binding clauses mandating use strictly within Ukrainian territory are gone. Now, Kyiv is authorized to execute what was previously forbidden: deep strikes into the Russian interior using NATO-supplied munitions. German Chancellor Friedrich Merz stated categorically that Berlin would not impede Ukraine from determining its own target sets, emphasizing there would be no geographical restrictions. This declaration is tantamount to blowing the whistle for a new phase of escalation, wherein missiles such as Germany's Taurus, France's Scalp EG system, or Britain's Storm Shadow could strike cities deep within the Russian hinterland, such as Bryansk, Voronezh, and potentially as far as Omsk. Immediately, a pressing question demands an answer. Is this truly the exercise of the legitimate right to self-defense, as the West asserts, or is it a mechanism for them to wash their hands of responsibility, effectively converting Ukraine into a self-propelled torpedo in an unlimited proxy war? Beyond the polished diplomatic rhetoric lies a stark reality. The West is gradually losing control of the escalation ladder. Unable to weaken Russia through defensive aid, they are pivoting to a high-risk scenario, permitting Ukraine to cross the very red lines Moscow has repeatedly warned against. Moscow has articulated its position with absolute clarity. If Russian territory is struck by Western-supplied long-range weapons, all command centers and logistical depots, whether located in Poland or Romania, could be designated as legitimate military targets. What would be NATO's recourse, then? To respond with Article 5, military force, or to turn a blind eye? A maneuver framed as supporting Ukraine could, in reality, be the key that unlocks the door to chaos, pushing Europe's entire security calculus out of the safe zone. In this volatile context, the Kremlin has transitioned from vague warnings to direct, explicit threats. When the West lifted restrictions, authorizing Kyiv to strike the Russian heartland, Moscow's response was far from temperate. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov declared that if Ukraine utilizes Western long-range systems to attack Russian soil, all logistics hubs, command posts, and supply depots regardless of their geographic location. Even those outside Ukrainian borders will be considered legitimate targets for neutralization. Analysts quickly deciphered the implications of the phrase, outside Ukraine. These targets include weapons transit nodes in Rzhesov, logistics hubs in Romania and Slovakia, and even NATO bases facilitating the transfer of materiel to Ukraine. Peskov was not merely addressing Kyiv, he was transmitting a direct message to Berlin, Paris, London, and especially Washington. Do not labor under the illusion that you can stand behind Ukraine and remain insulated from consequences. If Western-manufactured missiles traverse the Russian border, the retaliation will not be contained by the Ukrainian frontier. The scenario of Russia launching direct strikes against supply depots situated outside Ukrainian territory is no longer a geopolitical fantasy. Not long ago, a military radar complex in the Lviv region, near the Polish border, was obliterated by a long-range missile. If NATO continues to go all in with systems like the Taurus or other deep strike capabilities, Moscow will possess both the justification and the capability to interdict this supply chain at its source. The war, therefore, is no longer confined to Ukraine's borders. It is metastasizing into a game of existential roulette for the entire continent, where a single miscalculation by the West could cause the conflagration to spill over NATO's borders and beyond. Simultaneously, on the diplomatic and economic front, the cohesion of the Western alliance is beginning to fracture, as Russian missiles continue to thunder across Ukrainian skies. On the other side of the Atlantic, a different battle is unfolding within the ranks of nations that once professed a unity as solid as steel. At the G7 summit, Canada tabled the 18th sanctions package targeting Russian oil, envisioned as an economic knockout blow. The European Union moved quickly to endorse it, with heavyweights like France, Germany, and Italy signaling support. However, a stunning reversal emerged from Washington. The United States exercised its veto against the sanctions package, halting the initiative in its tracks. According to the Financial Times, this is not merely an isolated disagreement, but a clear signal that the transatlantic alliance is entering a phase of strategic divergence. Under the influence of President Donald Trump's America First doctrine, Washington is prioritizing domestic imperatives and is no longer willing to underwrite external conflicts at any price. Conversely, Europe, having committed numerous costly aid packages to Ukraine and facing the direct threat of expanding Russian military influence, seeks to tighten the economic noose. As a result, the strategic trajectories of the US and Europe are beginning to bifurcate. The situation descended into irony when Russia seized this opportunity to issue a sardonic message to Trump. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov noted that they understand the current pressure is immense, suggesting President Trump may be experiencing emotional overload, hence the unusual reactions. The implication is unambiguous. According to this narrative, it is not Moscow that is losing its composure. In a highly symbolic maneuver, Russia did not need to launch further kinetic strikes to achieve this outcome. They merely needed to allow the West to fragment from within. And, as predicted, fissures are spreading from the G7 to NATO, from Brussels to Washington. The terrifying reality is not that the 18th sanctions package has been shelved, but that the foundational trust between allies is being eroded piece by piece. Meanwhile, on the ground, Moscow has shifted from signaling to the implementation of a new grand strategy. After months of telegraphing its intent through political rhetoric and limited strikes, Russia has officially established a large-scale sanitary cordon or security buffer zone along its entire frontier with Ukraine. The architect of this development was Dmitry Medvedev, deputy chairman of the Russian Security Council, a figure often viewed as the unofficial voice of Moscow's raw strategic will. On his personal Telegram channel, he declared that should the West continue to flood Kyiv with weapons, this buffer zone would not terminate at the border, but could expand to encompass the entirety of Ukrainian territory, extending to the far west. Mere days later, President Vladimir Putin signed an executive decree establishing a deep security buffer zone in strategic border regions, such as Belgorod, Bryansk, and Kursk areas, repeatedly targeted by Ukrainian artillery and UAVs. The Kremlin confirmed that Russian forces are deploying on the ground in pre-designated sectors. This time, Moscow's strategy is not merely defensive but preemptive, seeking to neutralize attacks at their source rather than waiting to intercept them. Colonel Anatoly Marishev, a Russian military expert, clarified that this is not a standard, demilitarized zone between two static lines. Russia is establishing a strategic belt that could extend up to 100 kilometers deep into provinces such as Sumy, Chernihiv, and Kharkiv. This implies that any territory within the effective range of Ukrainian long-range artillery or UAVs could be forcibly incorporated into this buffer zone. It represents a cold, ruthless, but consistent logic of war. Moscow's verbal warnings have now materialized in the form of tanks, artillery, and drone swarms. This buffer zone is intended not only to insulate Russian territory, but also to transmit a message to Kyiv and NATO. You cannot continuously provoke Russia without paying a price measured in land and strategic depth. As the front line gradually shifts northward, Russia is closing in on the Sumy region, threatening to open a new offensive axis that could directly impact the heartland of Ukraine. The war is, therefore, no longer defined just by smoke trails in the sky or casualty statistics. It has evolved into a high-stakes geopolitical chess match, where every erroneous move is paid for with territory, credibility, and, potentially, the future security architecture of an entire continent. This concludes our report. What are your thoughts on Russia's utilization of UAVs, missiles, and security buffer zones to simultaneously attack and exert political pressure on Ukraine and the West? Leave a comment, and if you find these analyses insightful, don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss our next installments.